Well, here we are. I kind of can't believe it's already Wednesday. Believe me, we're a little bit relieved and also sad to be coming down to the wire on the California Adaptation Forum. It's always an exhilarating process, a fulfilling process, and pretty exhausting too for staff. So we're here at our final plenary, Investing in Resilience, Who Should Pay and How. And I hope that you've seen the arc that we've tried to craft for you from starting with equity, talking about governance, and now we're looking at action and tools and how do we actually build the frameworks, financial payment mechanisms to actually take this to scale and move forward the way we need to do. So I'm really excited about this session. I'm really excited about the speakers we have, and I'll just briefly provide an introduction. Initially, one of our superstar sponsors, Edison International, was going to provide an introduction, but the person, Adam Smith, who is going to do that, literally got called into a conversation about wildfire. So he's adapting, we're adapting, but we're very grateful for their support. So our moderator for this session is Kate Gordon, who many of you know from her work on the Risky Business Project. She's been a leader internationally, nationally, and certainly in California for her work on the intersection of clean energy and economic development. She wears a number of hats currently, including partner on the sustainability team of Ridge Lane Limited Partners, a senior advisor at the Polson Institute, a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and she has her own practice, if you could imagine that much going on. Gordon is perhaps best known for her work as the founder and director of the Risky Business Project, co-chaired by Michael Bloomberg, Henry Polson, and Tom Steyer, that focused on the economic risks the U.S. faces from unmitigated climate change. She continues to represent the project in public and private forums across the U.S. and internationally. She's a prolific writer and a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal as one of the paper's energy experts. She's currently at work on a book focused on the economic transition of communities built around fossil fuel extraction. Kate, welcome.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces and friends here, and also to be here with such an amazing panel. I'm really honored to get a chance to talk to these folks, all of whom are really doing this work day to day. I wanted to just say a couple words before we start the panel, and I bring up these folks about sort of what we mean by resilience. When we were doing the prep call for the panel, it emerged, and you'll hear that there's a lot of different ways to think about the word resilient, and I'm sure you've talked about this over the last couple of days. One of the things that's interesting to me, and we will be getting into, is sort of what does resilience mean to investors who are able to move money around from place to place? What does it mean for companies that some are able to move and think about supply chains and think about location decisions, and some are literally place-based? And what does it mean for communities? And one thing that we talked about, and I think you'll hear more about, is just for investors, a lot of the question is, how do we manage risk? How do we manage physical climate risk? How do we manage transition risk? How do we find opportunities in managing that? And where do investors put their money as a result? For some companies, and certainly for communities, the question is often less about where do we move that around and how do we evaluate risk and opportunity in a variety of places, but how do we actually withstand risk and thrive with opportunities when it comes to resilience? And I think we're going to talk about all of those approaches to resilience on the panel, as well as this kind of overarching question of, is this still kind of a niche investor issue, or are we at the cusp of seeing this become part of an integrated approach to mainstream investment and infrastructure planning? I hope yes, but we're going to have that conversation up here. So I'm going to ask the folks on the panel to come up, and I'll just give you brief introductions to them as they come up. Sanjay Wagle is the co-founder and managing director of the Lightsmith Group, formerly at DOE, someone I've been honored to work with for a lot of years. Shalini Vajhala is the founder and CEO of Refocus Partners. Tavia Barnes, the executive director of the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, so has a really critical state perspective to bring. And of course, Kat Taylor, CEO and founder of Beneficial State Bank, and again, someone I've had the privilege of getting to work with for years, and thrilled to have these folks here. So we are, just so you know, going to have some conversation up here, and then we will open for questions about 15 minutes before the end, and I believe there's mics at the edges of the room, so start thinking now about what you want to ask. Thank you. All right. Is this on? Yes. Hey, guys. Hi. Welcome. I am going to start with, the obligatory softball question, but it actually does bring out some of the key things that each of you are working on. And I'm going to start with Sanjay, who I'm warning you has a bit of a cold. So he has warned me he is not at his best, but his best is so far up here that I think you're going to still be impressed. So Sanjay and sort of everyone to think about this question. So where do you, in the work that you're doing at Lightsmith, and you can tell us a bit more about that, where do you see the biggest opportunities in sort of investing for resilience or managing resilience?
Sure. So at Lightsmith Group, we're raising what we think is the first private sector investment strategy focused exclusively on adaptation and resilience. And I think when we look at investing in adaptation, we tend to instinctively think about either infrastructure or venture capital, new technologies. And our idea is that we already have existing technologies, products, and services to manage risk. Climate change isn't creating new types of risk. It's taking existing risks and increasing them in frequency and severity, and maybe bringing them to new places. So we started looking across the economy for where are there tools for dealing with the kinds of risks being increased by climate change. Physical damage and disruption, resource scarcity, weather and financial and market volatility. And we found about 20 market segments where these companies exist. We mapped about 500 companies. And it totals about $130 billion in annual spending today, growing at about 20 to 30% a year. So an interesting set of areas to invest in, interesting set of tools. And that's the growth that's forecast even before factoring in climate change. So we think the spending is going to grow even faster. The kinds of tools we're interested in investing in tend to be more software tools. So this is things like agricultural analytics, supply chain analytics, geospatial imaging and mapping. None of these companies call themselves climate resilience anything. It's just that those are the kind of tools we're going to need increasingly in the future for our communities, for our businesses, to assess risks in an actionable, localized, asset-specific way, so we can know what the risks are from block to block and act on them.
And just a quick follow-up on that, you had said that this is true even not factoring in climate change. Is that because of resource scarcity? Like, what are the other factors that are playing it?
Just business drivers, right? So these companies have an existing business value proposition, and they also sell to governments, but they have a value proposition today that's profitable. It would help if they built in forward-looking predictive climate modeling into their software. We can make it more apt to the problems of climate change, but they already have a business proposition today.
That's great, and we'll dig in more on those opportunities. Shalini, you also were sort of looking on the opportunity side, and would love to hear about what you are seeing at Refocus, and tell us more about Refocus.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate, and thanks to the team at LGC for bringing us together here. So when we think about opportunities for investing in resilience, our team at Refocus, we are a collection of former public servants, and so we know where the straitjackets chafe. And so we come at resilience from a budget perspective. We look, exactly as Sanjay said, this is not about trying to convince someone to spend more money for something that's way out in the future. Most of the time when you're looking at resilient infrastructure projects, which is our focus, we tend to start with where a budget line item becomes unaffordable in the next year, in the next 2 years. And that may be for a small business that's spending $100 on sandbags, and then $1,000, and then $2,000. And all of a sudden you start seeing those impacts today, and they're directly correlated with the impacts that are going to increasingly become more of a burden on that business, on that government agency. And so we tend to work the problem backward. We ask, who loses money if this resilience solution doesn't go in place? In the case of a transit authority, that might look like running fewer trains less fast during high heat days. And the number of those days increases every year. And who does that affect the most? It affects those people commuting 2-3 hours a day that are among the poorest and most vulnerable. So rather than coming at it by saying, how do we protect this population? We look for the way to find the folks who have the money and are watching the purse strings get tighter. And that lets us come at things like designing green infrastructure to reduce urban heat island effects and having hospitals become part of the investment community, because you're flipping the question around. And it's a very counterintuitive way to think about things, but it's worked extraordinarily well for us, because it's let us open the door to a conversation about money that's not just about needing more resources. It's about using current resources more effectively and stretching them further.
Well, and in some ways, it's an opportunity approach, but it's also a risk approach, because you're essentially saying who bears the most risk if this does not happen, right?
That's exactly right.
It makes a ton of sense. Tavia, you're, coming to this from the state perspective and trying to balance a lot of different priorities, right? And also budgets that are often in political cycles that are shorter than what we're talking about. How are you approaching sort of both the risk and the opportunity side of resilience investment?
So we refer to ourselves as IBank fondly. And IBank, our mission is infrastructure and economic development financing. All of the financings that we do start from that premise. On the public side, we provide financing for projects to local governments, to cities, to counties. And what we try to provide is an incentive for them to move forward with the projects that they have deferred from an infrastructure perspective by providing the benefits that we have for our low cost of funding. We treat them as though they're our shareholders, and we pass on those benefits of our low costs to them by having discounts on the interest rate to lower the cost of the infrastructure projects. In 2015, with the governor's goals on reducing GHG emissions, we realized that IBank, because of our very broad authority for infrastructure and economic development financing, we can do anything and everything but housing. So we can't do where you eat and sleep, but we can do the roads, the sidewalks, the sewers, and everything around the housing. So I think IBank has a unique position in terms of being a state financing authority that's not limited to any one type. And so that gives us more latitude into the types of projects that we can finance. That being the case, we also recognize with the water, with the drought and the fires, that we needed additional incentives, not so much as an incentive to move the project forward, but to make the project affordable for the community. So we developed in 2015, we didn't want to call it green because we didn't know what green meant. So we called it CLEAN, the California Lending for Energy and Environmental Needs. And the CLEAN Center finances clean energy, water, any type of environmental project. And and pretty much leaving it open to whatever myself and the staff recommended to our 5-member board. We have a unique position in that we also don't need to go through we don't issue regulations. We issue policies and procedures that are approved by our board, or directives and requirements that are approved by our board. So we were able to establish and fund the CLEAN Center start talking about it 2 months after the governor did, and get it up and running within the next 10 months.
Has to be a record in the state.
Yeah, it was a record. We also, with the fires on October 9th was the fire, the North Bay fire. I live in Marin. I was awake at 1 in the morning thinking my house was on fire, and I had guests in the house, and just trying to figure out what was going on, and then learning online about the fires. I knew I needed to do something, so within that next 10 days after the fires, we established at IBank the Disaster Loan Guarantee Program for small businesses that provides up to 90% guarantees on loans to small businesses with from 1 to 750 employees that are in a disaster area, disaster declared or emergency declared area, and where the business has either had property damage or the business has economic damage. So say the fire didn't come anywhere near their business, but their customer base has disappeared. Okay. And so IBank, we try to stay nimble, we try to stay customer focused, and we try to be responsive to the needs that happen throughout the state as they occur.
Well, that's great. I'm going to come back to you on some specifics about how you balance those priorities against other state priorities in a minute. But I want to get to Kat, who I left for last on purpose, because I think you personally and through Beneficial have such a broad approach to what resilience means, and wanted to hear from you as, you know, Tavia sort of started broadening out this definition to disaster preparedness and other resilience goals. How are you seeing resilience, and where are you seeing opportunities?
Yeah. I fear I'm going to make Tavia's job much larger by the time this day is over. We're going to talk about that later. But, Beneficial State Bank is actually a bank in the banking system that's based on a triple bottom line model and a multi-stakeholder commitment. So we are in the marketplace with other banks having to compete. We are regulated, we are deposit taking, we are just like any other bank, but our design features are really different. And so I want to suggest that society at large is on the design side right now, because the economy we have is not serving us pretty much down the line in any sector, not happening. And so we need this wholesale change, and we need to have some compass points along the way. And the change might have to be shared broadly between local government, our public institutions like the IBank, and the private markets, because the private markets still deliver the lion's share of goods and services, particularly housing, which is a really critical function. So when we think about being on the design side, first and foremost, we put equity at the heart of every development paradigm. That has not been true in the past, and it has come back to bite us. In fact, our triple bottom line is we must serve social justice and environmental well-being at the same time that we're economically sustainable. If you think about the way we have prosecuted our natural resource agenda over the last 500 years, it has always set off oppression and diaspora. Think slavery, native genocide, less than personhood for women, immigrant and refugee persecution. Those were resource grabs that put populations and constituencies at extreme harm, and we can't do that again. So we're not allowed in our bank to separate social justice from environmental well-being. They're flip sides of the same coin. We also, because of the origins of our country, really need to put more and different people in charge right away. It's particularly possible in the state of California, which is now majority minority. And it's particularly possible through local government, where we are seeing utterly new candidates running. So the electeds represent more diversity, and you all in this room can choose more diversity. And I would say that's the only way we get it. You have to proactively choose diversity in order to get it. We also recognize that low resource communities are not deficit communities. They actually have extraordinary assets and abilities and empowerment and activism. And if we don't look at them that way, we miss a huge opportunity, and we do them an enormous disservice of a deficit model that doesn't hold and won't get us where we want to go. Brian Stevenson at Equal Justice Institute is famous for quoting first this quote, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. If you flip that, the real source of poverty is injustice. It is not endemic to any population, to any people, to any activities. It is a result of injustice. So we have to ferret that out. And ultimately, I believe we're going to have to find a palatable way to exercise reparations, to acknowledge the harms that have put people at utterly different starting lines in this economic race. So the design features of the bank are that 100% of the economic rights of the bank owned to a nonprofit. It's a public charity permanently governed in the public interest. And that governance is super important. We do not have good governance in the banking sector in general. We have an preferencing of the equity shareholder who is not bearing the amount of risk that they should. So they're getting away with murder, quite literally, because they have very high profit outcomes without bearing the real risk in the banking system. So we didn't want to do that. We wanted to serve underbanked communities and the environment upon which we all depend with a good governance model. That means at the end of the day also any profits in the bank as distributed through the dividend process can only go back to the low-income communities that we serve and the environment upon which we depend by our bylaws. There's no equity shareholder forcing us to maximize their return, much less getting one. The second design feature is we think of banking as the original and most powerful form of crowdfunding. It's not that a specific deposit funds a specific loan, but all deposits fund a lending practice. And when we pool our idle cash, which we call deposits together, it amounts to a powerful low-cost funding mechanism, $12 trillion in the American economy alone. Our cost of funds is 80 basis points. That's super cheap money that's aggregating super facilely. So we need to control that flow of funding because we put it all together in that pool wanting to fund the best place to live and work for all, and we're not getting it. We're getting a train of misery right now. So I would argue the best thing we can do in the private banking system, the private banking markets, not private banking, but the banks that operate in the capital markets that we know, is to discipline their lending practice. We also need to worry about their transactional products. Nobody needs 6 or 8 accounts. Never did, never will. And those products, deposit and transactional products, need to be fair and transparent. But we should keep our eye on the lending practice. And that's what the crowd recognized in places like Dakota Access Pipeline. You're not going to use our deposit funding to trample on indigenous rights, destroy a local resource called water, and accelerate global climate change. Not on our watch. I'm an 8. So the third design feature of the bank, and then I'll hush because I have a bunch of other stuff to talk about in terms of public finance mechanisms, including the IBank, and private innovations in the capital markets and particularly in banking finance. But the third design feature is we need radical transparency in all corporate practices. The SEC should be requiring all corporations to report on everything they do, not just the shiny, bright objects that they put in the full-page New York Times ad. That, for us, means that, for instance, we pay our employees to live, not just to work. They have to be paid to live. We have a crisis in America of underpayment, not of unemployment. And the power of workers to assemble and organize and get their fair shake in the value creation of our economy is waned to an absolute low that cannot persist. So we pay 150% of living wage as calculated by the MIT living wage calculator in all markets fully benefited. I would tell you that in the main banking system, 1/3 of bank tellers are on some form of public assistance because they're simply not getting enough hours and they get no benefits. And that is a shocking transfer of a private cost by the most profitable corporations in America to a public resource called the taxpayer. So radical transparency, that lending practice, and the governance vehicle. And then we'll talk about the really creative, wonderful things in our future in terms of public and private finance.
Great, thank you, Kat. Opening up the definition, I have to say I absolutely agree with you on the need to be intentional about diversity, and I just want to give props to Kif for making this a very diverse panel, although not enough men, which I never get to say, so I had to say it. We've talked here, and you guys have opened up sort of how do we do investment for the economy we want to have, right? And we should have. How do we do investment for the climate we know is changing? Getting to brass tacks, since the title of this panel is Who Pays for It? Getting to brass tacks, how do you do that? I mean, Tavia, I think on our prep call you said at the end of the day we're still bankers, right? And you're in a position where you the public, you're in the public eye, you have to deal with state budgets, you have legislators, you have all these different competing priorities, and you're having to be fiscally responsible, as are we all. Starting with you, sort of how do you operationalize this when you're looking out in time horizons that are not always in the mind share of the public or the financial system, and you're balancing all these priorities? How do you actually, what tools are you using, and how are you paying for it?
Okay, I need to step back a little bit and focus, just explain our unique situation, another feature of IBank's unique situation. IBank was formed in 1994, and the folks who, Burks and Peace, the legislators who got together to develop IBank, they wanted a financing vehicle in the state government that was not limited by government. And so they made it so that our programs, our infrastructure, state revolving fund, our small business finance center are continuously appropriated. So I don't have to go back to the legislature to get an appropriation for the programs. I do need to go to the legislature to get an appropriation for my admin, for my staff, and to pay the rent. That's small potatoes compared to the millions and billions of dollars of economic development. And we have $40 billion of infrastructure and economic development that we have enabled. That being the case, we recognize, we're always mindful of the fact that we have a unique platform, and but we also are bankers. So while the statute allows us to give grants, I don't have funds to give grants. And so we coordinate with other agencies, and there are other, like the State Water Resources Control Board has grant funding. So if we, if a city comes to us for a water, or a water district comes to us for a water project, and they don't pencil out the underwriting, it's still underwriting. I try to reduce the cost to them because the default rate in the municipal market is very, very low. So I know how to identify the risk and what is appropriate, but not everyone is bank ready. We try not to say no, we say not yet, and then we provide technical assistance to get them to that point. And so when they are truly not ready and in the foreseeable future, we try to direct them and refer to other sources of grant funding. And then we do the priorities. We don't have limited time periods. We take them as they come in. Very much customer service. But we can have a situation where I'm going to the bank for a water district and also for the disaster relief program and for a conduit bond deal where the communities are all over the map. And the beauty is we know how to look at the credit risk and account for that. We also take into consideration low wealth communities. So if a project is in a community that has high unemployment or low medium household income, we lower their interest rate. And so we could have two communities coming in with a 2.3, 2.5 interest rate. One is a AA rated and one is not rated. Rated. So we try to get to yes, but we're still bankers at the end of the day. And I think that's what Kat is talking about, the transparency, the oversight. When I came to IBank, we didn't have a chief credit officer. We didn't have a chief compliance officer. So those were top priorities for us.
Well, and you've both talked about, and I think particularly in the government context, de-risking and providing technical assistance. These are things that you're uniquely capable of doing because you've got the larger government infrastructure, but they do also kind of move the ball in the direction that you're trying to go. And then moving into the private sector, these conversations that you guys have probably all been talking about TCFD for 3 days, but about governance and about transparency are critical. Moving into the pure private sector, and Sanjay and Shalini, I want to hear from you on this. How are you making the case to investors or governments that this makes sense to spend money on when there's competing priorities? Who is coming to you, who's paying from your perspective, and you're having to make this very kind of cold capitalist argument about why this makes sense. How are you managing that? How are you doing that? Shalini, you want to start and I'll go to you, Sanjay.
Yeah, please. So we practice a form of financial jujitsu because, Kat, I think a lot of what we do is defining resilience as a measurable financial risk reduction, where it shows up on a balance sheet, it helps get you to those bankable projects, and the bridge we help build is working with communities who may have an idea, but an idea is not a project. Like an idea about coastal protection is not a bankable wetland or seawall. And so there's a design leap, right? And funding that is very often a grant process. And we work with philanthropic partners to do that. We work with nonprofit partners to make that leap, to get to the 10%, 30%, 60% design. In the design process, we build in the financing strategy. And this is where you get to the system change. So typically, if you're designing something like a coastal protection or a wildfire protection, even if it is a public project, you are not only protecting public assets. This is incredibly important. We have taken for granted that public infrastructure is a public good, and that is false. You are creating private goods, and we need to be able to capture that value. And a lot of times what we do is have very simple conversations with private companies that are upstream or downstream or the wrong side of a fire line. And we ask, we said, you look like you're gonna lose money if this project doesn't happen. Let me tell you how long this project will sit on the drawing board without your involvement. Would you like to bear those 10 years worth of risk? Here's what it will cost, increasing every year. Now let's talk about how we pull you all together into a payment structure to get this project off the drawing board and into the ground.
And so you're really translating it into kind of present risk, is what I'm hearing. You're saying essentially, here are the near-term impacts of not going in this direction, and then you're probably in the back of your mind thinking, here are the long-term savings as well.
Actually, we're doing both. So yeah, it's a good point. We do start with the present risks because that's how you get the door open. If you're trying to get new money, the conversation is, that's wonderful, talk to me in 5 years. Yeah. So we start with present risks. One of the things we've been doing to try to create the system change that you're talking about, Kat, is we've been working with the insurance industry to use catastrophe models. So these are things that I don't know how people sleep at night that work on these models. They do things like model 10,000 hurricanes hitting the eastern seaboard and then look at the total expected losses. And the numbers are staggering, right? The simple thing you can do with these models, one of the things that these models have going for them, there are many things that are broken, but one of the things they do well is that they are entirely transparent, and there are about $30 billion worth of insurance transactions riding on these models. So you don't have to sell investors on whether the models work. They believe the models. They're already betting on them. What we do is we use those models, those trusted models, and we run a world with a protection and without. So now here's the price of your insurance if that coastal protection goes in and if it doesn't. If that seawall under the Embarcadero is seismically retrofit, here's how the insurance costs for $75 billion in assets behind that wall change. So it's not just present costs, it is future costs, but the key is that there is a connection to a balance sheet today.
Well, and future costs, and I'm hearing loud and clear, and anyone who knows me knows I agree with this, using language that's already trusted and understood, right? It's you're taking models that they understand and you're essentially applying those. And I'm sure, Sanjay, that you're looking at catastrophe models too.
Yeah.
You're doing work all over the world. I'm actually interested in, A, why are people interested in investing in these products? Why is this where they're going? But B, do you see a big difference in how people are looking at these issues and how they're thinking about future and current risk across different countries?
Sure. Just in response to what Shalini said, yeah, catastrophe risk modeling is a very interesting area of software. It's the kind of tool that can actually assess and model these risks. Unfortunately, it's all backward looking, right? It's based on the last 10, 20, 50 years, and so they're becoming increasingly inaccurate. We need to update those models for what the future will look like. But it's still a very powerful set of tools and an interesting area. You can actually apply the risk assessment to screen real estate development, infrastructure development, possibly even financial assets. So software tools like that, until you know the future probabilities and costs of damage and loss, you can't know the payback for investments in adaptation, right? Those are the kind of tools that will help us build the business case and the government case, the public investment case for investing in adaptation, right? You need to know the future costs and the payback on reduction in costs.
Just really quickly on that, I keep hearing about new companies starting who are coming up with new models to do that. Do you feel like that world is improving? Like, do you feel like the data analytics is improving on this?
It's exciting. Philosophically, our approach is to go with existing technologies, right? So catastrophe risk models run by companies that are already accepted and regulatorily approved in the insurance industry, that you can then tune for the problems of climate change, I think are a better way as an investor to go than new technologies, although venture capital and new technologies are also a valid approach. It's just we like going this way. To your question about, and then I'll get to the international part, investors. So we think of this as one integrated strategy that's affecting real problems, benefiting communities and businesses and the economy, but also generating returns. To us, it's one integrated thing, but we still have to speak two totally different languages to different investors. On the private side, yes, impact investing is thankfully a growing field, but we almost have to downplay. They don't want to hear necessarily about climate change. They want to hear how it's going to deliver them returns. Thankfully, we're being received by pension funds and foundations, endowments, looking for growth equity returns as a differentiated approach to doing that. So we're getting some good reception there. On the government side, we are getting good response from governments, mainly, unsurprisingly, European governments, and development banks that are looking at this as a way to finally start the private sector acting and investing on climate adaptation. And in particular, they're responding to our global focus, meaning companies wherever they are, and market opportunities, including in developing countries. And so private equity is a difficult tool to use for inclusion and diversity, but we're trying to ensure that these tools are given access in developing countries, including low-income populations, and with gender equity. So it's a hard thing to do. We're also trying to measure the impacts on adaptation and the gender and diversity impacts.
That is a big lift, but it's super exciting, and particularly that in some of the countries you're working with and the folks you're working with, you're starting to see this get beyond, as you said, the sort of classic ESG impact investment world into something more mainstream. And that goes to my question to you, Kat, which you laid out a vision which is, of course, much broader than the investment community, right? And then it's certainly broader than ESG, but it's much broader than the investment community. What tools are you using as a sort of ambassador of the bank and using the bank's tools, but also what tools do you see out there in the marketplace, whether they're government programs or they're existing financial tools that can move the idea of resilience into the mainstream of how we think about money and money flows?
Yeah. So I'm a woman with a hammer. Every problem is a nail, and it's finance, but public and private finance. And that's why I love the IBank. But let me just back up a second, because I think there's an element of planning that's very suitable for government to do, but it's not a bad idea for all of us to do. So I carry in my mind an overlap map and we're trying to build this out with an honest-to-God cartographer and open public data sets, big data sets, where you simply map the capital assets, the transportation grid infrastructure, and the job bases of the old non-renewable industries that we know, the monopoly board ones, the ones that we can't afford to take with us into the future. And it's a long list: mining, conventional timber, textile, paper, prisons, a lot of things. You know, you take that map and you overlay on top of that the renewable industries, and there's an even longer list of those. All the information-based industries, smart manufactured wood, timber, smart textile. We don't need paper so much anymore. All the renewable energy industries, solar, wind, energy retrofit, everything. If you map those industries over that infrastructure map, you get a pretty good correlation. So for instance, just taking the county of Los Angeles, we mapped the mining interests. Now, understandably, they're where the people aren't, because it's hard to run a mine in the middle of the densest part of LA County. But they also happen to be the highest rated solar territory. So could you take that capital investment, pivot it to solar and the job base too? When you start thinking about design at that level, you run into finance right away. And it's really important to think about public and private finance. And I love that Shalini was questioning our concept of economics because it's long overdue for a refresh. So public goods generate private gain. They're called public goods because they're undersupplied in the marketplace that's purely driven by private interests, because they can't capture all of the gain of the investment to themselves. It's open sourced, education, military, a lot of things. So when we rethink finance, we stumble into a much bigger opportunity set. And I'm going to start in the public finance arena because we have Tavia here who's running, and she's right, she's a banker first. She has to assess risk, underwrite, and deploy capital in a way that she's guaranteed to get it back, or at least almost all of it back. And that's a really important function in society. That's how we invest today for future gain. So if you look at public finance, right now, California is one of the few states that has an infrastructure bank. We could afford to have a lot more public banking institutions because they tackle something that's really important in getting from the historic map to the new overlap map. It's chicken and egg problems. So we would love as a bank to finance community solar. It makes so much sense. It's mostly passed with an opt-out only, so you could pretty much guarantee that the same ratepayers who are paying their utilities over the last 30 years are going to keep paying them in the next 30 years. But as a regulated banking institution, I can't show that to our regulators. They are not going to use past as prologue. They want to see an established track record stream of payments that's going to pay back our debt. We can't do that, but a public bank can, because it's designed to overcome the chicken and egg. It's not without its challenges, and I'm not saying that Tavia's job is easy, but that's a more appropriate public banking institution to tackle something like that. It's also easier for them to identify a borrower than it is for us. Most of the community solar borrowers are some sort of a entity that was just stood up, and it doesn't have much in the way of financial wherewithal in it. So I don't want to get into the arcane minutia of banking per se, but just to say there's room for us all. So our mission at Beneficial State Bank is to change the banking system for good, because nothing less will suffice. We have to stop the harm emanating from the banking system first, and then get on to how we can generate benefit to all and harm to none in an ideal world. And definitely public finance is going to play a part in that. So I think we have room for public banks to be stood up in other areas to do that critical infrastructure, renewable economy kind of lending, to downstream important capital for small business formation. Small business is still the lion's share generator of jobs in this country, and it's woefully underfunded, underfinanced by banking. Banking stepped out of small business markets. FinTech didn't step fully into it. So when Tavia is downstreaming capital to community banks to lend to small business, that is a critical function in the economy. We could do a lot more of it. We also need to discipline those transactional products in the main banking system, and arguably a government-sourced bank for government employees to have fair and transparent transactional services could be a huge boon to the rest of us banking in the regular banking system. Municipal bond finance. There are fintech companies, Neighborly comes to mind in particular, reimagining the humble municipal bond. Now, because of blockchain and really clean data sets and a lot of sort of fancy stuff that we finally have the wherewithal to do, we can issue municipal bonds at a much lower small dollar level and track them and know exactly what they're financing. So in our near-term future is the possibility of people investing in municipal bonds at as low as $3,000 and knowing that they're supporting bike paths, pollution mitigation, and climate remediation. And they're not doing something they hate. Also, the idea of universal basic assets. We have income disparity problems in this country, the biggest that we've ever seen, but the wealth disparity is even more egregious. And that's what's going to really bite us. So let's fuse together reparations, the idea of universal basic assets, meaning every person in society has assets, and universal basic income, meaning everybody has enough income to live. Desperation is really expensive to society. Why don't we solve it by making sure everybody has an earning asset and everybody has sufficient income? If we were to do that, where are we going to get that from, right? Well, we are participants in a myriad number of network effects. The definition of a network effect is that every member who joins increases the value for every other member in the network. Think telephone system, internet, but arguably banking has a network effect. Various sub-elements of the internet. The internet is nothing without our participation. I don't care what the venture capitalists say to us. The internet is nothing without our participation. And if you want to see the specter of defection stripping value, look at the reaction to Facebook's Cambridge Analytica. Okay? So we have the power of defection even when we don't have income or assets. So could we imagine a world where everybody owned a micro share of the internet, and that prevented them from being desperate? There's also new models one called the Community Investment Trust, the possibility of every human being investing in the place where we live, work, and shop, because we're creating the value in that network too. When we live, work, and shop, we literally provide the proceeds to pay back the debt on those investments. I want to just quickly move into the private bank market.
And then I'm going to do questions soon, Kat, so I'm going to move you.
Okay,
good.
No,
so, you can, just a couple more words is great.
I don't want to give the answer to your question, but anyway, there's innovation we could do in public banking and public finance, and there's innovation in the private bank markets too. The power of banking comes from the public. You all, through the taxpayers and the electeds, support federal deposit insurance. That allows the banks to self-insure in a way that's backstopped by the American government. That's super powerful. That's why we collect deposits so cheaply. So that means it's a quasi-public system, and we should be asking more of it. The power of the banking system also comes from leverage. So we have the most conservatively leveraged bank, meaning our capital ratios are the highest of any bank in the system. And even so, for every $1 of equity in our bank, we can collect $9 of deposit to create exponential effect. So we should be using that quasi-public charter and that leverage for public benefit. And here are 5 quick examples. When we finance multifamily, which is small apartment buildings, we are actually creating a platform completely perfect for energy retrofit and generation, solar, wind, everything else. But we have something called the landlord-tenant split incentive problem, that the landlord never shares it with the tenant doesn't benefit from it, so there's no effect in the rental markets of it. If we were to lower our cost of capital for landlords who would both implement energy retrofit and generation and share it with the tenants, we can literally lower their cost of capital. Same for affordability. We could, through subsidy, lower the cost of capital for a landlord investor such that they're indifferent to keeping rents at affordability because they're paying less in capital. Opportunity zones are coming up. That's an attraction of long-term capital gains capital into designated census tracts. That could be a flood of capital. I would caution that we want to make sure it goes to good things, not bad things. Good capital never cleans up after bad capital. And we have also the possibility that the Federal Reserve could exercise quantitative easing. This is an idea of the Democracy Collaborative, to buy controlling interests in the largest energy companies in this country and make them keep their reserves in the ground. So lots of creative finance opportunities out there.
Thank you. There's always about 20 panels that could come on every subject that Kat brings up. But sadly, we're only on one. And I do want to have time for audience questions. So I'm going to ask you to, if you have questions, go to the mics. I'm going to ask you all one more quick question as people go to the mics, which is about a particular tool that none of you has said, but you've all sort of alluded to. Everyone has talked a lot about transparency and data as we've been having this conversation. And one of the big things, of course, that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, calls for is disclosure, although it's voluntary in the TCFD context. I'm just interested in whether you all think that disclosure of risk profiles of companies and entities is a thing that would help move the ball in a big way. Do you see it as something that's a necessary or a big part of the solution? Sanjay, I'll start with you.
Sure, I absolutely do. I mean, first of all, in order to disclose, there have to be standards for that, right? And how do they do the assessment? What tools do they use? The kinds of companies we're looking at do those kind of assessments. But the better quality of that analysis, I think, is as important as the disclosure. Yep. But I think the disclosure, I also tend to think that not only will it drive companies to recognize the risks that they're facing and act to manage them, I also think it'll help them to realize the importance of acting to prevent climate change from getting worse.
So a yes on mandatory disclosure that goes beyond boilerplate is what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, and I think, look to France, where it's being mandated first. The banks there are already acting on that, and I think that's resulting in changes. But also, I think independently of disclosure, it's already starting with the ratings agencies.
Great. And you guys want to weigh in on disclosure? Go ahead.
So being a state entity, I'm subject to the Public Records Act, so
you already have disclosure.
I have disclosure. You can send me an email, phone in, and ask us about all of our programs. We have all of our policies and procedures and criteria on our website. We assume we're a public entity that you can see anything, pretty much. And so we're all on board on that.
You want others to join you in the world of disclosure.
Yes, to level the playing field.
Shawnee,
I think it's an interesting question. Oddly, I don't know that corporate disclosures would change how we work at the project finance level. And it's largely because the information we need is already out there, and the motivations for getting people to act on projects you don't need really fine technical details. You're looking for the right number of zeros on a balance sheet to get someone's attention. I do think, can I just take a quick poll of the room? How many designers and planners are out there in the audience? Okay, like a good third of you. All of you should be paying attention to this, because you will have to think about finance if you want your projects to get off the desk, off the drawing board. And disclosure is a great way for you to have a source of information that does not require you to become a banker. I am an architect and an engineer. I now play a banker on TV, which should terrify everyone. But one of the things that we find really important is finding sources of information on this question of who loses money or who benefits from my project. And so I would encourage all of the designers and planners in this room to start looking at this information in your design process the same way you look at community and site information. Don't treat it like something that only rocket scientists deal with.
Smart. That's a great piece of advice. Kat, on disclosure specifically?
Yeah, so we support Sustainable Accounting Standards Board work, which is the FASB Next Gen, which is trying to impose an affirmative obligation on publicly listed corporations to disclose under the materiality clause non-financial risks. And it just makes sense. It just super makes sense. It's part of risk-based pricing. It's part of risk mitigation and planning and everything else. I think also that we have pretty full-blown risk-based pricing, but it's not taking into account all of the risks. It's mostly just those financial risks. I would favor on top of risk-based pricing, which would be, you know, if a company's rated AAA, they get lower cost of capital, or even when we underwrite a small business client, we have to do risk-based pricing based on the risk of their default. Right. We should do behavior-based pricing too. Like, how well are you contributing to society, or how badly are you punishing society? Your cost of capital, your cost of finance should be lower or higher depending upon that. And we're dependent, if we're going to change the banking system for good, it's going to come from a responsibility of the biggest banks to report on to whom and what they are lending, because they know they're just not required, beyond concentrations and CRA, they're not required to tell us. You'd be horrified if you knew, especially if your money is sleeping overnight in one of them.
Tabia, you want to weigh in on
Yeah,
that?
I just want to also make a distinction about IBank. So yes, we are bankers and we look at the transaction as a traditional banker would. But we have an additional criteria, and that is there has to be a public benefit. So we look at the source of repayment, and if it's ratepayer funds, we look at the project. Is that project benefiting those ratepayers? We have actually had a situation where we got a project, there was tons of money to repay us, no problem on the underwriting, but the benefits were going to a completely different community. And we said, no, that's not going to work for IBank. And because it was part of our criteria from the beginning, that's approved by our board and on our website, and everybody knows, no one could say I was being arbitrary and capricious, which sometimes
Well, it goes
they
to the
say.
transparency point too. I've been totally ignoring this whole side of the room, so I'm going to go to you first for a question because my back has been to you. Sorry, everybody.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Sorry, the room setup is such that you can't see
It is,
me.
and let me just say really briefly that we have about 10 minutes, so questions
Right.
short, answers short. Go ahead.
All right, I'm Stephen Mack, and I'd like to know if there's reconsideration of the definition of equity. I'm going to give you two quick examples. Back in the 1970s, there was something called, I believe, Neighborhood Housing Services, and they did lending for rehab of homes in low-income areas. It combined public interest, private banks, and neighborhood people. Part of the redefinition of equity in that case was if somebody who wanted a loan could get the support of the neighborhood, said, he's a good person, he will repay the loan, even though he didn't have what was appropriate for banking standards. The second is from Colombia, and I know it won't work here, but there was a credit union that was kind of just struggling along, and they redefined equity for their loans as a compadrazgo, which is the godparent of a person's child, even if it was but they're both very poor. If the compadrazgo would co-sign on the loan, then they would give it. They ended up being one of the largest financial institutions in Colombia. So that was a very radical redefinition. Is there any consideration of that? Somebody defines it. Does it always have to be the bankers?
Kat, I'll go to you on that since you've been focused on equity in this conversation. Thoughts about the redefinition of equity and how that might be operationalized?
When I said put equity at the heart of the development paradigm, I meant fairness, equity, not equality, fairness, given where we came from. But in terms of a different definition of equity as in the net worth of an individual or the equity at stake in a business that's taken a loan, well, I thought you were going somewhere else. So I'm a little flat-footed on this. I don't actually know how to respond. There are some big public network banks in South America that work very, very well to do a lot of housing finance because they're government-backed. There is something called a shared appreciation mortgage that was sort of a rising star, and then we suffered the Great Recession, which was the ability of outside equity investors to take a piece of the down payment and share in the appreciated value of a home, which was allowed somebody to get into a home at a lower price. There are community land trust models where the land equity is held in community trust and simply the structure, the equity in the built structure is owned by the person. I'm sorry, sir, I just feel a little ill-equipped to answer your question.
Well, and you talked about this a little already, which is, ownership models where there's more shared ownership and universal basic assets. And I think you actually did get to this a bit in some of your answers.
I think the best one is that community investment trust. If you go to Mercy Corps Northwest, their website, they have a really good description of that.
Great. Over on this side.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I really appreciate all your insights on investment. I think one of the challenges I see is that we're addicted to building things and very poor at maintaining and operating them. And I think a common theme, is so how can we actually get investment in maintaining and operating and managing what we have rather than continuing to buy new things?
Shalini, go to you for this.
Oh, I love questions about maintenance. So that is such a great question. And a lot of what we do, the insurance instruments that I was describing that include things like resilience bonds, where you're capturing savings and creating essentially a rebate to pay for project capital, can be used for maintenance. And that is a core part of why we care about bringing these funds forward. So we want to make a seawall look like a toll road where you can do life cycle cost accounting. And that's a big part of how we think about filling those gaps. The nice thing also about starting the problem with who loses money, deferred maintenance is a major budget hole. And it's not just a budget hole that you haven't filled by needing to pay for something. It creates holes in other parts of the budget. When you can't get, for example, a train down a supply chain or trucks to a train. So this is a great way of dealing with a maintenance problem, is finding who loses money when that maintenance is slowing things down, creating crises, or setting people up to fail over a longer term. So incredibly important and a big part of what we do.
Great. And Sanjay, you wanted to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, this is why software is helpful. Using the power of data to find more efficient ways to operate and maintain things that also reduce susceptibility to damage. So one example is a company we just met with that is doing digital mapping for electric utilities around the world, including one large utility here in California. And they're doing a big project on vegetation mapping. So detailed identification of trees and shrubs in vicinity to power lines and power equipment, which faces different risks based on either storm or fire. Obviously, that's becoming very important here in California due to, in part, to climate change. But that would be impossible to do without these software tools.
That is a great intersection of technology and information. On this side, again, I think I'm going to get the high sign in like 3 minutes. So quick questions.
Quick question. So you talk a lot about financing for very large-scale projects. What about on the much smaller scale, the neighborhood scale? Do you have suggestions for financing on the much smaller scale? And foundations, it's very, very competitive to get that kind of funding.
Tavia.
So we finance projects $50,000 and up. Most of them come in start around $1 million to $1 million to $30 million. We have a project coming in September to the board that's $510,000. So, but normally on the public side, they come to IBank for the larger projects because of the lower cost, and to the extent they can aggregate them or come in with two related projects, they get a better bang for their buck.
Well, and I would just point to something Kat brought up, which is I would look at the opportunity zone incentive. It's interesting because you can create an opportunity fund that then can finance a number of things in a particular zone. It doesn't have to be just one project, and that could become an interesting way to aggregate some of these funds.
And then just one more. I haven't really talked as much about our small business. We also developed last year, within a month or two, our Jumpstart program. And because we found out on the small business side that in low wealth communities, there was no CRA. There's no banks, there's no CRA, there's nothing. And so we do direct loans from IBank from $500 to $10,000 to small businesses that include nonprofits. So it really is Jumpstart because it's generally someone who needs to get a barbershop or childcare, having babysitting in their home and getting the licenses. So in any given day, we can be working on a $40, $55 million project and a $500 project.
Just on the opportunity
please,
zones,
go
because
ahead.
you're in a position of authority to do something about this. It's a very broad tax incentive. It essentially says 25% of all census tracts in any state, as designated by the governor of the state, that meet the means test are eligible to receive long-term capital gains finance through an opportunity fund. If it stays for 7 years, it's very lightly taxed. If it stays for 10, it's not taxed at all. This is going to be a lot of money coming in. And by definition, it's going to be financial first and only money because that's who has long-term capital gains. There's no restriction other than sin industries on what it can finance.
And golf courses,
And golf courses. But that means it could finance fracking, private prisons, pawn shop franchises, luxury housing that displaces any number of things that we don't want to visit on low resource communities. And honestly, the only constraint I can see on it is local zoning and local community benefit regulations. So I hope you guys are alert to the possibilities of some really bad capital marauding around again, because the good side of it's good, but if we just get a bunch of bad stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's incredibly important to say, when you designate things like zones, and opportunity zones are a huge opportunity, you have to be really careful about projects that are for a community and projects that are being proposed at a community.
That's very true.
When the money is trying to move quickly, you generally get projects at communities, and those are the destructive ones. So everything you all can do to keep your eyes out to make sure that these are driven by local needs and that there is the planning support to make sure they meet those local needs is incredibly important. So all of you who are grant makers, look for those places to invest in that early planning so you have something that is, it makes me shudder to use the term, but close to shovel ready.
And it goes back to something we've talked about a lot on this panel, which is, again, the need for standards and the need for transparency. There is a way to think about opportunity funds as having a set of standards like resilience, sustainability, and equity that can be incorporated into the fund and into the investments. I wish we had time for a lot more questions. We have, several of us will be around during lunch, and you can certainly come and talk to us. I'm going to bring Kif back up here to say a few more words, but first I want to thank this amazing panel for all their great insights.